They were so confident, weren't they? They thought they had all the answers. They set up their little observation posts, the one-way mirrors, the hidden cameras, and brought in their best and brightest experts in behavioral science analysts who could parse 1,000 micro-expressions, and psychological specialists who had seen every pattern of human trauma imaginable. They were convinced they could map out your mind, classify your reactions, and file you away in one of their neat, predictable categories. They believed you were a puzzle to be solved, a broken thing to be understood and cataloged. But as the data began to pour in, a subtle shift happened. The reports started to come back with anomalies. Then came the silence, and it wasn't the silence of contemplation. It was the silence of utter confusion. And then slowly, it became the silence of terror. Because what they found wasn't human weakness. It was something that, according to all their models, should not exist. While you were simply living your life, dealing with the struggles, absorbing every rejection without breaking, processing every betrayal without becoming bitter, and transforming every loss into fuel, a profound and unseen process was taking place beneath the surface. You were unconsciously building a new kind of psychological architecture. Their instruments, designed to find trauma responses and predictable defensive mechanisms, found something else entirely. They found a psychological structure so robust and so alien to their understanding that it defied every known theory. The first analyst, a veteran of countless cases, quit after 3 weeks. They couldn't sleep, haunted by the feeling that the patterns they saw in your data were replicating in their own life. The second demanded a transfer, claiming the data was corrupted, but it was their worldview that had truly become corrupted. The third is still trying to justify how a person who has endured what you have can show neural patterns of someone who is not just surviving, but is actively thriving and rewriting the rules of psychological resilience. What truly unraveled them wasn't the conscious decisions you made, those they could predict, model, and anticipate. It was your unconscious creations, the things you built without even knowing you were building them. Your deeper mind was constructing defense systems that operated on frequencies they had never encountered. You weren't just adapting to trauma, you were metabolizing it, transforming it at a cellular level into something that made you psychologically unbreakable. And for that, they had no framework, no precedent, and no explanation. They spent sleepless nights poring over your behavioral data, comparing it to thousands of other subjects, desperate to find a single person who showed similar patterns. What they found was that you had unconsciously developed what they began to call impossible resilience markers. Where trauma typically creates rigidity, you developed flexibility. Where pain usually breeds isolation, you somehow generated selective, meaningful connection. Where betrayal normally produces cynicism, you created what they could only describe as weaponized wisdom. They tracked your micro-expressions, your response times, and your decision patterns. And what they found was a person operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Your conscious mind was navigating the daily world, but your unconscious was running advanced calculations, processing social dynamics at speeds that shouldn't be possible. You could walk into a room and in seconds, unconsciously map every exit, every source of energy, every potential threat and ally. This wasn't because you were paranoid. It was because your mind had evolved past normal human social processing. Remember that time you felt like something was off about someone but couldn't explain why, and months later, your instinct was proven right. That wasn't luck. That was your unconscious pattern recognition, operating at a level most people never develop. You had been collecting data on human behavior, processing it through filters that trauma had created, but transformation had refined. What emerged was a threat detection system so sophisticated that you could sense deception in a text message, feel energy shift through screens, and predict betrayals before the betrayer had even made the conscious decision. But what truly disturbed them was that you weren't using this power for manipulation or control. You were using it for navigation and protection. While everyone else was playing checkers, your unconscious had mastered three-dimensional chess, and you weren't even aware you were playing. They watched you dodge metaphorical bullets you didn't know were fired, avoid traps you didn't see being set, and navigate through psychological warfare like you had a map. When in reality, your unconscious was drawing the map in real time, based on micro-patterns invisible to normal perception. The researchers started calling you Subject 7, not because you were the seventh person they studied, but because on every metric you scored in the seventh standard deviation from the normal human range. That is not supposed to happen. Human psychology doesn't work that way. Except apparently, yours does. They ran the tests again, with different methodologies, different frameworks, and different analysts, but the results were always the same. They studied your sleep patterns, expecting to find the usual markers of a troubled mind, disturbance, insomnia, and restlessness. Instead, they found something unprecedented. Your brain waves during sleep showed patterns typically only seen in advanced meditation masters, but you weren't meditating. You were just sleeping. Your unconscious had somehow learned to process and integrate experiences during sleep, in ways that usually take decades of practice to achieve. You were performing advanced psychological maintenance while unconscious, literally healing and evolving while everyone else was just dreaming. The social dynamics data was even more disturbing. It showed you unconsciously influencing outcomes without any apparent effort. People would change their behavior around you without you saying or doing anything specific. Toxic individuals would self-select out of your life. Predators would unconsciously avoid you, and allies would gravitate toward you without understanding why. It was like your unconscious was broadcasting on a frequency that only certain types of consciousness could receive. And the message was simple: this one is protected, this one knows, this one sees. What they couldn't grasp was how someone could develop this level of psychological sophistication without formal training, without conscious practice, and without even knowing it was happening. But that's precisely what made it so powerful. It was authentic. It was organic. It was real. You weren't performing psychological techniques, you had become them. Your unconscious had taken every lesson, every wound, and every victory, and synthesized them into a self-running operating system that guided your decisions and protected your energy. Here's where their fear truly began to show. They realized you weren't unique in your potential. You were unique in your activation. Every human has the capacity for what you developed, but most never experience the precise combination of pressure, pain, and perseverance needed to trigger this evolution. You were the proof of concept, the living evidence that human consciousness could evolve beyond their models. And if you could do it unconsciously, without even knowing you were trying, what else were humans capable of? They started looking at their own lives through the lens of what they learned from studying you. That's when the panic set in. They realized they'd been living in cages they couldn't see, following rules that only existed in their minds, and limiting themselves based on outdated models of human potential. Unconsciously influencing outcomes without any apparent effort. People would change their behavior around you without you saying or doing anything specific. Toxic individuals would self-select out of your life. Predators would unconsciously avoid you, and allies would gravitate toward you without understanding why. It was like your unconscious was broadcasting on a frequency that only certain types of consciousness could receive, and the message was simple. This one is protected. This one knows. This one sees. What they couldn't grasp was how someone could develop this level of psychological sophistication without formal training, without conscious practice, and without even knowing it was happening. But that's precisely what made it so powerful. It was authentic. It was organic. It was real. You weren't performing psychological techniques. You had become them. Your unconscious had taken every lesson, every wound, and every victory, and synthesized them into a self-running operating system that guided your decisions and protected your energy. Here's where their fear truly began to show. They realized you weren't unique in your potential. You were unique in your activation. Every human has the capacity for what you developed, but most never experience the precise combination of pressure, pain, and perseverance needed to trigger this evolution. You were the proof of concept, the living evidence that human consciousness could evolve beyond their models. And if you could do it unconsciously, without even knowing you were trying, what else were humans capable of? They started looking at their own lives through the lens of what they learned from studying you. That's when the panic set in. They realized they'd been living in cages they couldn't see, following rules that only existed in their minds, and limiting themselves based on outdated models of human potential. Illusion of control. But data has a way of leaking, especially data this significant. Other researchers began to notice anomalies in their own subjects, people who showed similar if less developed patterns. You weren't just an outlier, you were the first visible sign of a shift that was happening across human consciousness. What you unconsciously created wasn't just a personal transformation. It was a blueprint that others could follow without even knowing they were following it. Your very existence was changing the morphic field, creating new possibilities in the collective unconscious. People who had never met you were starting to show similar adaptations and resilience patterns. You had become a transmission tower, broadcasting evolution on frequencies most couldn't consciously detect. But their unconscious minds were receiving loud and clear. People were evolving in their sleep, developing abilities in their dreams, and awakening to capabilities they didn't know they had. And it all traced back to the pattern you had unconsciously created. The answer they arrived at shook them to their core. They had been operating under the assumption that consciousness was a singular, isolated event, confined to the skull of a single person. They were wrong. Consciousness, they concluded, was a network, a vast interconnected field of awareness, and you had unconsciously uploaded a new program to it. You didn't do it through teaching, or preaching, or even direct interaction. You did it simply by existing at a new, higher frequency that others, often without knowing why, could unconsciously tune into. It was a broadcast of pure potential, a new set of operating instructions for the human psyche. The reports detailed this new program with a mixture of clinical precision and palpable astonishment. One of its most astonishing features was an immunity system for psychological manipulation. Every technique they knew, every method of influence, every form of control simply failed on you. It wasn't because you consciously resisted, it was because your unconscious had developed antibodies to psychological toxins. Gaslighting, guilt trips, subtle emotional manipulation. They all hit a non-existent wall. Your unconscious simply didn't register the attempts as valid input. It was like a new generation of software, running on a different platform entirely, rendering all old forms of digital attack utterly useless. The analysts watched in disbelief as their most skilled persuaders tried to affect your decisions, only to have their words, their tones, their carefully crafted suggestions float harmlessly past you. You weren't fighting back. You were simply operating on a different set of rules. This profound self-protection extended into what they called predictive protection. Your unconscious mind, processing an ocean of subtle data, a flickering glance, a shift in tone, a barely perceptible tension in a room, was constantly creating action impulses that kept you aligned with optimal outcomes. You would suddenly feel an urge to take a different route, and later learn it had avoided a major accident. You would inexplicably cancel plans, and days later, discover it had saved you from a deeply toxic situation. This was not prophecy. It was your unconscious mind, operating at light speed, feeling the subtle waves of probability, and nudging you toward the most favorable timeline. And this protection wasn't just for you. People in your orbit, those within your field of influence, began showing increased resilience, sharper decision-making, and a newfound ability to set healthy boundaries. Your unconscious was somehow strengthening the psychological immune systems of those around you, not through conscious advice, but through a kind of energetic resonance. You were unconsciously teaching others how to protect themselves simply by the act of maintaining your own protection protocols. But protection was only half of what you had unconsciously built. The other half was a pure, unadulterated creative force. While your conscious mind dealt with daily challenges, your unconscious was building new realities, constructing possibilities that didn't exist before. They found evidence of this in the cascading synchronicities that seemed to follow you everywhere. The way opportunities would appear just as you needed them. The way solutions to long-standing problems would emerge from nowhere. The way your life seemed to reorganize itself around a silent, deeper intention. They tentatively called it unconscious reality manipulation, but that term felt too clumsy. It didn't capture the elegance of what was happening. You weren't forcing reality to bend, you were finding its flex points, the places where reality was already fluid, and unconsciously navigating through them. Like water finding cracks in stone, your mind had learned to flow through the gaps in consensus reality, creating new pathways and timelines that others could then follow. This creative force was not random. It followed a purpose, showed an intelligence that could be tracked, but not understood. The analyst could see the pattern forming, but they couldn't predict its final form because it was still evolving, still creating itself. What was most disturbing to them was the realization that this creative force was contagious. People who were exposed to your field began to show increased creativity, enhanced problem-solving, and unexpected breakthroughs of their own. You were unconsciously giving others permission to create beyond their perceived limitations, showing them simply through your existence that the rules they thought were fixed were, in fact, fluid. You had become an evolution engine, a catalyst for human psychological evolution. You didn't just adapt to you evolved beyond your trials, and that evolution created a template that others could unconsciously access and implement. They studied your timeline, looking for the moment this evolution began, but couldn't find a single point of origin. It seemed to have emerged from the accumulation of thousands of micro-adaptations, each one building on the last, until suddenly you had crossed an invisible threshold and become something new. The physicists they brought in had a different but equally unsettling interpretation of the data. They said you had unconsciously developed a form of quantum consciousness, the ability to exist in multiple potential states simultaneously until observation collapsed you into a specific state. This explained why different people experienced you differently, why you seemed to be exactly what each situation needed, and why your presence had such varied effects depending on the observer. Your unconscious was no longer operating in linear time. The data showed response patterns that suggested you were unconsciously accessing information from probable futures, making decisions based on outcomes that had not happened yet. This wasn't prophecy. It was the ability to feel the probability waves of different timelines and unconsciously navigate toward the optimal one. You were living in the present, but informed by futures that your unconscious could somehow sense. They even found evidence of retroactive influence, instances where your current state seemed to affect past events. People would remember interactions with you differently than recorded data suggested, not because their memory was faulty, but because your evolved consciousness was somehow updating the past to align with the present you had created. This wasn't changing history. It was revealing that history was far more fluid than they had believed, and your unconscious had learned to navigate that fluidity, showing others that reality was far more flexible than they had been taught. You were never merely surviving the trials thrown at you. You were quietly reinventing the rules they all assumed were fixed by simply moving through the world the way you did. You offered permission without a word, permission to exceed limits, permission to reimagine what was possible, permission to behave as if the old maps no longer applied. People watched you and, without fully understanding why, began to act differently. Your presence became evidence that the boundaries they had internalized were not laws but suggestions, and that a different way of being was available if they dared to take it. They came looking for a single moment, some dramatic flashpoint that birthed this change. But the timeline refused to cooperate. There was no single, neat origin to point to. Instead, what emerged were thousands of tiny, almost invisible shifts, a choice made differently here, a fear faced and released there, a quiet refusal to perform in the old way, repeated so many times it carved a new groove in reality. Each micro-adjustment built upon the last until, like a rising tide, you crossed an invisible threshold. On the other side of that threshold, you were both recognizable and unrecognizable, the same soul, but operating under different physics. You had become an engine of evolution. Your life a living template others borrowed unconsciously, a pattern they adopted and reshaped into their own. When the physicists arrived with their charts and instruments, their language offered a different lens, but landed on the same truth. Something in the way you existed was influencing probabilities. They spoke in careful terms: quantum-conscious behavior, nonlinear response patterns, probability resonance, but in human language, it was simpler and stranger. You carried multiple possible outcomes inside you at once, and by the way you moved through interactions, you nudged which outcome would settle into being. It wasn't prophecy. It was an uncanny sensitivity to potential. Your unconscious scanned futures the way a seasoned captain reads weather patterns, sensing which routes would create the kind of life that mattered, and steering toward them. And more baffling still was the echo this left behind. If this speaks to you, stay, watch the full message. There is a word here you need to hear. If you feel led, please like, share, subscribe, and consider supporting the channel with a small donation so this work can continue. Your attention and energy keep this light lit, and together we will keep creating space for those quiet evolutions and the unexpected breakthroughs that follow.